Okay. Okay. All right, good. I think we're ready to go. So I want to welcome everyone here tonight to the 7th of June version of the Berean, Messianic Bereans. And I was waiting for Al Sumi to get online, and so when he got online, I could do a one of these great big "Go Bears," because that was the day that today, 48 years ago, he and I graduated from the Coast Guard Academy on the 7th of June. So if he does come on online, we'll mention that anyway. So. All right, let's go ahead and start with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. All right, tonight we're going to be doing chapters 5 and 6 of 2 Samuel, and this is here's our timeline. We are right about here. Okay, this is what we're going to be do. Actually, this date. This was 1004 BCE, and this is where David was. He's about 37 years old at this point. All right, so that's what we're seeing here in 2 Samuel, and also we see some of this a parallel in 1 Chronicles also. So so here we are on this timeline, showing that David is beginning his reign in Jerusalem. We got a new capital now and a new worship center. And so that's where we are, chapters 5 and 6. Okay. Now, were there any comments or questions from the previous classes that you may have had about David and so forth? Anything? All right. Then let's go ahead and get going. Now here's our map, of where all of this is going to be taking place, everything that we're going to be talking about in chapter 5. And you can see here that this area here, there's that, and we're going to be talking about taking over Jerusalem, and all of the elders coming down to Hebron, because David actually he reigned down here in Hebron as the king of Judah for about 7 years before he went up here, and Ishbosheth had already, the son of Saul, had already been deposed, and but David just waited. He didn't go up there and try to take over or anything. He was just there, and then they actually came down to him. So this is where we're talking about. We start out in Hebron, then everything else takes place right up here in just a couple of miles from Jerusalem here. Okay. So chapter 5, what do we got? Chapter 5 is David is crowned the king over all Israel, and so let's go ahead and we'll read that part of it in the scriptures. In 2 Samuel 5, 1 through 5, then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and spoke, saying, "Here we are, your own flesh and blood. Even before, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led Israel out and back. Also Adonai said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, be ruler over Israel. over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king of Hebron, and King David cut a covenant with them at Hebron before Adonai. Then they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. Um, in Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years. Overall, Israel and Judah. So, where they're talking about, first of all, we had up here the first verse. They had all of the tribes of Israel came to David. Okay, now what does that mean? All the tribes. That meant that they sent messengers to David, and he, or envoys, or however you want to call that. But representatives of the tribes came to David, and it's like what we do today when we're doing treaties with other countries. You have the State Department and other different ones coming together, and they'll talk to the people of the other country, and they'll, everything is agreed to on paper. Once they get it all agreed to, then they bring in the leaders of the country, and they sign the agreement that has already been hammered out, weeks ahead of time, and then that way there's no glitches. And so this is what they did. They sent the envoys down to Hebron, and they're coming and saying, okay, look, it's been a while, but you are our flesh and blood, and we're kinsmen. Even though David was down in Judah, and Israel and all the tribes were up there in the north part, they considered that, okay, we're gonna go ahead and claim this idea of being kinsmen. We're all in this together. We're all Israelites. We're all Hebrews. However they wanted to do that. And said even before Saul, even before when Saul was king, you're the one that led Israel in and out, and that in and out, or out and back, kind of, that refers to battle. That's when David would lead, and remember that David would go out into battle, and then the ladies would sing when they came back, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And so gave Saul that little bit of complex that he carried with him to his grave. And so so now they're now acknowledging, though, that even, I mean, it must have been pretty common knowledge by this time that David had been anointed by God to take over from Saul. So all of those 7 years that they didn't have him up there as the head of Israel, that was partly just Abner and others that didn't really want to give up their power, and so basically they were in denial of what God had for the Israel, and for the whole of the Israelite people. And so now this is so they acknowledge that, and they said, you will shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over Israel. Now this is the first time in the Bible that they equate the idea of a shepherd with a ruler or a king, that the king shepherd kind of a thing. That's the first time it's actually mentioned in the Bible. Now this concept, though, was not uncommon in Middle Eastern literature and the early Middle Eastern time, because we know that Hammurabi was spoken of as being the shepherd of the people of Babylon. And so that was, it was something, the concept that the king was supposed to care for his people is a nice concept, and too often they didn't care for their people very well. So anyway, these guys, they're laying on the diplomatic language, and so then here it is now in verse 3, then all the elders of Israel came to Hebron. So that first ones, they were just lower level State Department types, and they came and drafted up all of this, and David agreed, they agreed, and so forth with the terms of how this was going to happen. Then the elders, the other 10 or 11 elders of the tribes, they came down and they cut a covenant with David. Now, generally, these covenants, you would have a suzerain. They call it a suzerain covenant, and that's when that normally when one kingdom conquers another kingdom, then the suzerain or the winner then gets to dictate the terms of the surrender, and so then they would have a covenant. And so we're not told exactly what's in this covenant, but generally, they to cut a covenant meant that they would take some animals, cut them in half, lay them out one side of a path, and then on the other side of a path, and then the parties of the covenant then would walk between the dead animals. And this is the idea of that is that may we be like these dead animals if we negate this covenant, or if we break this covenant or this treaty. You remember that that's what God did with Abraham, except for one thing. It was a unilateral covenant with Abraham. He caused Abraham to go to sleep, and God walked through the middle of the animals, meaning that no matter what Abraham did, this was an everlasting covenant with Abraham, between Abraham and God. So Abraham could not fail because he didn't walk through the animals. But here, David would have walked through, and the tribal elders would have walked through the animals, and in that way they're making an agreement that they're wanting David to be their king. So then they anointed David king over Israel. Now this is actually the third time that David had been anointed. You remember the first time is when Samuel anointed him in he had been brought in out of the field, as it were. He was out tending the sheep, and so he would have probably been somewhere late teens, early 20s, I think. Some people even say, no, he was like 10 years old. No, the ages don't work out that well. So he would have been a little bit older, and because by then, he's already talking about, well, he'd killed a bear and he'd killed a lion, and most 10 or 12-year-olds probably have not done that. So then we see that they're talking about the second time he was anointed was when he was anointed king over just Judah, and then the third time he was anointed now king over Israel, and therefore the entire unified body of all Israel from Dan to Beersheba. So he was 30 years old, and when he began to reign in Judah, and now he is 37 years old, and then he will reign a total of 40 years, and 7 years down in Hebron, and roughly 33 years up in Jerusalem. All right, so going ahead. In verse 6, now the king and his soldiers marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the region. But they said to David, you'll never get in here. Even the blind and the lame could ward you off, thinking David can't get in here. Nevertheless, David did capture the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And on that day, David said, whoever would conquer the Jebusites must strike through the water shaft to those lame and blind whom David's soul despises. That is why they used to say the lame and blind couldn't get into the house. So David occupied the stronghold and renamed it the city of David. Then David fortified it all around from the Millo inward. David continued to grow stronger, for Adonai Elohim Tsevaot was with him. All right, so here we're seeing that David now captures Jerusalem. Now, how did he do that? Well, there was this water shaft, and what they did was they snuck in, and there's a place here, and I apologize for this being kind of pixelated for you, but it's about the best one I could find to show you. Here down in the Kidron Valley, there was an entrance. Now, this Hezekiah's tunnel was not there. Okay, there was an access that went into this tunnel. There's also another access that was blocked here. But you see, here was the city wall that the Jebusites had come up with, and actually this area down here, the Kidron Valley, they had a little fortification there to protect the spring, the Gihon spring. Here's a better picture of it like that. So here's the fortification around the Gihon spring. You like my pictures? And so you know, this fortification here was sort of to keep the enemy out, but it was also I would imagine it was to keep maybe keep critters out, keep it cleaner, and so forth. So there was a vertical shaft here that basically they could come in and drop a bucket down in here and get to water. They get to the water table. Now later on, this water table, Hezekiah built a tunnel that would go all the way under the city and go to the Pool of Siloam, and that tunnel is still there today. That it's called Hezekiah's tunnel, and we actually went through that at one point, and it is very cold. And but at the time of David, that was not here. And so basically he was able to get some men in here, and they walked through this, you know, basically through the water up to this shaft. And here's what Gihon Spring looks like today. And then this is Warren's Shaft. It actually exists. I mean, it's there. We've seen it. You can go down. Well, you really don't go down in the shaft anymore. But it's small enough that they were able to climb up in this shaft, you know, just holding onto the sides or pushing up against the sides. And they got people up in here, enough people that they could either overcome the guards. It doesn't really tell us how they did this once they were up inside the city, but they got up enough people inside there that they were able to overcome the resistance. And because, you know, these guys were not expecting David to even be able to do anything, and so they weren't watching, you know, because here they are, said, shoot, even the blind man and the lame man and the cripples could defend us against you, David, because you just can't get in here. And so then that's so that's exactly what they did. They got in there, and at that point were able to overcome the guards or whatever, and open up the gates, and the rest of them came in, and so forth. So that's then what happened. Now you asked the question. It was called then the City of David. That Jerusalem is now called the City of David, and in some cases they called Bethlehem the City of David. But the first mention in the Old Testament of Jerusalem was actually as the City of David is found right here in 2 Samuel 5:7. David captured the fortress, which is the City of David, that's called it. And so he had already been made king over the entire nation of Israel, and he led his army to take Jerusalem from the Jebusites. Now, upon winning then, he took up residence in the fortress that was in that the city of Jebus, that the Jebusites had occupied for a long, long time. It had never been conquered. You know, when Joshua came through and they conquered everything around it, they never conquered Jerusalem. And so these guys, throughout all those years, had been there, so they felt pretty secure that the Israelites, the Hebrews, were not going to conquer them. They were not going to mess with them because they were just too strong. And so basically, with that, you know, the Jews said, "Okay, we're probably not going to conquer you," and the Jebusites said, "Well, yeah." So then they had commerce back and forth and so forth. But anyway, David took up residence there in the fortress that they had in what was Jerusalem, and then he built up around that, even put up other walls further out from where the Jebusites had, and so even though Jerusalem had existed before, it was Jebus, Jebus. It was known as the city of David after David conquered it, and he, during his reign, of course, he developed it, and it grew and grew and grew, and then we're going to see in chapter 6 where he brings the ark to Jerusalem, and then that's where he makes the plans for the temple that was going to be built under Solomon, and so the supplies for the temple were going to be in this the area of Jerusalem. Now, in the Old Testament, the phrase "City of David" is used of Jerusalem 45 times, and in the New Testament, it's found twice. The city of David is found twice, but in the New Testament, it's not talking about Jerusalem. It's talking about Bethlehem, where David was born. Just a little different, a little bit different take on it. The practice of naming a city after its leader was very common in the ancient Mediterranean world. You know, Heshbon was a city of Sihon, its king, and then 1 Samuel 15 talks about the city of Amalek, and so forth. So other cities took their names from a founder like Alexandria, or a notable characteristic like Jericho, the city of palm trees, or over in Babylon, the Susa was a local deity. Now, and Susa was also the site of later on of a pretty famous yeshiva during the captivity and afterwards. So Jerusalem has been known to be the city of David now for 3,000 years, and so God continues to keep his the memory of his servant David alive, you know, all the way through. There's been, of course, a close association between David and Yeshua, the son of David, and you know, both were born in Bethlehem and died in Jerusalem. Both came from obscurity to become kings. Both were devoted to God. Yeshua was a descendant of David from the tribe of Judah, where David first reigned. So all those similarities. And now, in fact, the city of David is the place where Yeshua is going to reign in the future, because in the temple that is going to be built after the Great Tribulation, that's where Yeshua will reign from the Holy of Holies in the city of Jerusalem. And then, of course, later on, it talks about the New Jerusalem, where it'll reign forever and ever after the millennium. Different Bible study. All right, so here we go. Then King Hiram of Tyre sends envoys to David with cedar logs, carpenters, and masons. They built a palace for David. So here's a case of this guy, King Hiram. He wanted a treaty with David. He did not want any hassles with David, and so he basically just came and did some nice things for him. They built a palace out of cedar, and which, you know, that'd be great to have a palace out of cedar, because that keeps the bugs away. And um, so then David realized that it was Adonai had established him as king over Israel, and that he exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Big contrast here between David and Saul, where, you know, Saul was more of a me kind of guy. David, with all of his faults and all of his failures, he still recognized that, hey, you know what? It's God that put me here into this place. Then in verses 13 to 16 said, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. Now, these are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem. And the bunch of, Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Haphia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. All right, easy for you to say. All right, so here David kind of shows again that, all right, he is not a perfect guy, because God had told the kings, he said, if you have a king, when you're going to have a king, says, don't take a bunch of wives, don't get it. And so by this time, David already had 6, and that, you know, from Hebron, and almost all of them were political in nature. You know, he was cementing relationships between this faction or that faction by taking on a wife. And here's, like, I think it may be the only place in the Bible where it talks about concubines and wives rather than wives and concubines. So it kind of puts David in a disparaging light, as it were, here. And so, you know, here again, he's got he falls into this trap, the Middle Eastern king trap, of having this harem. Basically, he's got a big harem, and it's going to actually come back to bite him later on. We'll see that. In going ahead to any comments or questions here so far? Please just jump in, unmute yourself, and jump in anytime you have a comment or question. All right. So verse 17, now when the Philistines heard that David was anointed king over Israel, all of the Philistines marched up searching for David. When David heard about it, he went down to the stronghold. And the Philistines came and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. Then David inquired of Adonai, should I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them over into my hand? Adonai answered David, go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines over in your hand. So David came to Baal Perazim, and David struck them down there. So he said, Adonai has broken through my enemies before me like the breakthrough of waters. That is why he named the place Baal Perazim, where the God breaks through, is basically what that means. They abandoned their idols there, so David and his men removed them. They left their idols there, so David and men, you know, they removed them, took and got rid of them. All right, so here's a case of the Philistines. You know, they had, at one point, David worked for them, and now they look at David and they says, okay, now he's no longer just the king of Judah down there in the south, but now he's a king of Israel. All of the whole united Israel thing from Dan to Beersheba, and so this is land that we had claimed. So now we're going to have to go up against him. All right, so they came up the first time. This was probably right after David had become the king of Israel, and so they came up to him, and they decided they're going to fight him. Well, David does something that's characteristic of what he always does. He had already done. He went to the Lord and said, "Okay, should I go up against these guys?" He didn't take matters into his own hands. He inquired of the Lord. That's something that David had a habit of doing. It's a good example for us today, that we don't go off willy nilly and do things, big life changing things, until we do a lot of time in prayer about it. So this is what David went. He went and prayed, and God said, "Yes, go to them." All right, but then we come to verses 22 to 25. Now, the Philistines marched up, and they spread out in the valley of Rephaim again. So, we don't know how much time there was between the first time that David came against them and was successful, and until the second time. There may have been a short interval, but it may have been several years. We don't know. Uh, and the text around it, it just doesn't tell us. And so when David inquired of Adonai, it says, when, there again, he did that. God told him, he says, "Do not go up. Instead, circle around behind them and attack them in front of the balsam trees. Now it will be when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then you must act. For then Adonai will have gone out before you to strike the camp of the Philistines." David did just as Adonai had commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines from Geba as far as Gezer. So this time, different, maybe, different configuration of troops and enemy and so forth. And God said, "No, we're not going to, don't go and do a head-on confrontation with them, but draw them in, circle around behind them, and, basically cut off their supply lines and get behind them so that they have no place to go." And then he says, when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees. All right, what was this sound of marching? Well, that was no other than God's own army and his own angels coming to the support of David and his troops. And that sound of marching and so forth, it would have terrified the Philistines. It says, and when you hear the sound, he says, then you must act. So this was not a case of David just sitting back and said, "Okay, I think the Lord's got this one now. We'll just sit here and watch it go." No, it didn't happen like that. He says, then you must act. So sometimes when God sets things ahead of us, he prepares us, he gets everything all lined up, then we have to act. We have to do something. We cannot go and like I say a lot of times, there is no place in God's kingdom for a tookus ministry where you just sit on your can and let other people do it. No, we have to act. And so they went and they defeated the Philistines, and from Geba to Gezer. And so that was basically they pushed them all back to the coast, is what that means, and opened up the Central Valley again to the Israelites. So, all right, now we're going to get into the 2 Samuel, the 6th chapter. All right, any comments or questions here on the 5th chapter so far? All right, then on the sixth chapter, verse 1. Now David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. That's how big his army really was, about 30,000. Then David and all the people who were with him arose and set out from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the very name of Adonai Tzvaot, who is enthroned between the cherubim. So they loaded the ark of God on a new cart and carried it out of the house of Abinadab that was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, Abinadab's son, drove the new cart as they brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Now, with the ark of God, and Ahio was walking in front of the ark. Meanwhile, David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating before Adonai with all kinds of instruments made of cypress wood, with harps, lyres, tambourines, three-stringed instruments, and cymbals. All right, so the ark had been down there in that area for almost 80 years, I guess it was down there, and so basically a whole generation it had been out of basically out of service. That the the ark was down there. The tabernacle, as it had stood over in Shiloh, was gone. The Philistines had destroyed that. So anyway, they're going up against to get this thing, and he had 30,000 guys. Now, why did he do that? Well, because this might have been it had been down there with Abinadab for a long time, and the Philistines may have thought, well, you know what? He's going down there to get that. This would be a good opportunity then to defeat David, because they'd already been beaten twice. And so he just took his 30,000 guys as a precaution. And plus, that's a nice parade when you can go those 10 or 15 miles from where it was at to bring it into Jerusalem, to bring it up to Jerusalem. So then it says when they're on their way, but then when they reached the threshing floor of Nahon, Uzzah reached out to the ark of God and grasped it, for the oxen had stumbled. Then the anger of Adonai was kindled against Uzzah. God struck him down there for his irreverence, so that he died there beside the ark of God. David was upset because of Adonai's outburst against Uzzah. That place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. So David was frightened of Adonai that day, and then he said, how can the ark of Adonai come to me? So here we have, okay, this is kind of one of those kind of things that you look at and you say, well, why is this like this? Why is this being done? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Because God had very specific instructions as to how to carry the ark. It had to be carried by the Levites, and it was to be covered by a blue, they call it a porpoise skin. We're not really sure what that porpoise skin was, but it was to be covered. So anytime that you see pictures of the ark, them carrying the ark and the trumpets are blowing and everything. And if you're seeing a picture of the ark, well, then that's inaccurate, because the ark was always supposed to be covered when it was in transit. So even when they would take it into battle, the ark was covered. Only when they brought it back into the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle or in the temple was the ark to be uncovered. So it was never uncovered when they were traveling. And here's where we're talking about. Remember that the ark had been taken up here at Ebenezer, and they'd taken it on a parade all throughout the Philistine territories, and everywhere it went, the plague followed them. And so finally they decided, this is not good. We're going to go ahead and give it back to the Israelites. And so that's when they brought it over to Kiriath Jearim, and that's where it stayed then for 80 years. And so that's where David then went back down to get it and to start transporting it back over into Jerusalem. This kind of a circuitous path, but that's a better route than like way up over this mountain and down into that valley and then back up and so forth. This is a more of a level path for them to carry it. So that's where how they were doing that. All right. So David was actually, he was at this point, they put it in a place, a man who had a place to put it in, and they put it there at the house of Obed Edom, or Edom, Obed Edom, the Gittite. And so the ark of Adonai remained in the house of Obed Edom the Gittite 3 months. Meanwhile, Adonai blessed Obed Edom and his entire household. So they decided, okay, we gotta stop and regroup here. We don't know. So they took the ark, and before it had stayed in someone's house for many years, and so they put it over into this house of Obed Edom the Gittite. And we don't really know that much more about him other than God richly blessed him with when the ark was there. So obviously he took the ark and reverenced it and took care of it. And they however, for whatever reason, we don't know whether he was a Levite or whatever, but he reverenced it, and God blessed him for it. So in verses 12 through 15, so then it was reported to King David, saying, Adonai has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought the ark of God up from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with joy. Now, when the bearers of the ark of Adonai had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. Meanwhile, David was dancing before Adonai with all his might, while he was wearing a linen ephod. So David and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of Adonai with shouting and the sound of the shofar. Now, that 6 paces, that's kind of a strange thing there, but it was probably a test. David, by this time, he had gotten the Levites, he'd gotten his act together and regrouped and figured out, the ark is not supposed to be on a cart. Now the Philistines, they'd put it on a cart and paraded it all around the Philistine territory, but they were allowed to do that by God because they were not his chosen people, and he didn't tell them not to carry it by an ox cart. But he told his own people that the only time that that's going to be carried is by Levites, and it has to be on the poles, and there's a certain way to do all of this. So David was saying, okay, let's kind of, all right, pick the thing up and walk 6 paces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, set it down. They set it down, looked around, saw that all of the, you okay? You okay? You okay? Okay? Everybody's okay? Let's have a sacrifice here. So they made up a sacrifice of a bull and a calf, and at that point, then they, decided, okay, now we can go the rest of the way. Well, once they got up toward Jerusalem, then said that he was wearing an ephod, a linen ephod. Okay, and so linen, the linen ephod, that was a garment of a priest, and it was another indication of David's priestly services. Even though he was from the tribe of Judah, he was not from the tribe of Levi. He was he took on some of those duties, and the ephod was a small apron, I guess you'd use for ceremonial occasions. Now the high priest, had an ephod like this. Okay, that's a high priest one, where they've got the stones here. But the other that they would have would be more like a a wrapping around, or just it could have been something like this priestly one, but this was not made out of. I mean, this was a woven thing. It was not a. It was wool, and whereas then they would wear linen underneath this, but the ephod itself was not made out of linen. And the priests, they were also told that when they would serve and go up on the altar and so forth, because it was an elevated altar, they'd have to carry it up a ramp, that they were to wear uh, underwear, okay, for modesty, because that basically they were going to be elevated, and it's like it would have been like watching a Scotsman walk up a ladder. Don't look, and so Scotsman in a kilt. Okay, if you didn't get that reference. All right, so possibly then what David might have been wearing was something like this, like a loincloth. All right, now so just kind of getting maybe get back into my notes, because I got on a rabbit trail there. David obviously wore nothing else, because this was the cause of Michal, his wife's contempt. Now there's a parallel account in the Chronicles, First Chronicles 15:27, that he wore a fine linen robe like all of the Levites did. However, that robe may very well have been cast aside during his dancing, and because just the gist of this whole thing was that David exposed himself somehow while he was dancing, and one of the writers said that Michal despised David because she assumed that his purpose was to expose himself in some kind of a you know, all of these she called these servant girls out there. So he was strutting his stuff out there in front of all of them, and that's what she was assuming. Possibly, I don't know, so really there was no way to justify this, what he was doing dancing like this. Um, if he was dressed like the text kind of assumes that he was, or kind of indicates that he was, then indecent exposure was almost a certainty, and so that was the scantiliness of the little bit of clothes that he had on, if was what Michal was so upset about. Now, the word used for dancing here in 2 Samuel 6:14 is mekarker, and it is found nowhere else in the Bible except right here where it's describing David. Mekarker is only two places, and it's not like regular dancing, like what we call Davidic dance, in the Messianic circles. Okay, um, so we do not do Davidic dance, really and truly, because if we did Davidic dance, that means you'd take your clothes off and go swirling around like crazy, like a whirling dervish. We don't do that, hopefully. All right. So, and that's kind of what this word means. Only two places. This is the only place that it's used in the entire Bible, is right there, and it connotates the idea of whirling around like a dervish. And if you've ever seen pictures of what they call these whirling dervishes over in the Middle East, where they just go into a state of uh, just craziness, because they're going round and round and round and round and round until they kind of lose track of themselves. So this kind of conduct was forbidden to the priests. They were specifically commanded to wear breeches, and underwear, uh, so that in Exodus 28 it says, what's the purpose? To conceal your nakedness. I don't want people looking up underneath your tunics while you're way up there, and seeing what they're not supposed to see, because basically you're a priest, you're supposed to be sacrificing animals, you're not supposed to be up there as a spectacle. And so the purpose of the breeches was exclusively to prevent exposure of their, their private parts. So why this instruction? Ritual nakedness, especially for priests, was it was a feature of some of the ancient religions, ancient pagan religions. And it was not supposed to be in Israel. God said, no way. So, to say the least, David was offering sacrifices, let's say, without the prescribed underwear which God had commanded. So, this is what he's. Um, it was. It was David, and so. Um, I had, in fact, I don't know what happened to my picture there. In fact, I'll try to, I'm gonna even try to track it down here before we leave. I'm gonna finish off here. But the ark of Adonai entered the city of David. Saul's daughter Michal looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before Adonai, so she despised him in her heart. Most of the commentators we have consulted, uh, they take a real negative view of Michal because they, accuse her of pride, irreligion, lack of love for David, dishonoring him, and failing to show proper respect for him. But you know, maybe she was justified because I'm gonna cut her some slack here, because in the first place, it was sinful for David to take back Michal as his wife. Deuteronomy 17:17 says that. So David broke God's law by taking her back, and obviously Michal and Paltiel, her husband, they had a good marriage, and they loved each other. So David's his sinful act in taking her away was probably never forgiven by Michal. She, I'm sure she was upset, and so she was brought from a loving family relationship into David's harem as just one of many women, and so sure, she's going to be upset. And so, personally, I don't think that David really loved Michal at this point. He's got a dozen different wives and concubines, and every one of these marriages seem to be founded on political, financial, or whatever other motives, and none of them actually demanded remarrying Michal. Now, some say, well, this reinforced his claim to Saul's throne, but I don't buy it. It seems to me that it's more motivated by David was just spiteful. He's the king now, and he can do what he wants to, and he wants that woman back to her proper place, under my thumb. So added to that, with all the basically the pagan dance that David exposed himself shamefully, and all of that combined, no wonder she was looking down on him. So they in verse 16, they brought the ark of Adonai and set it in its place in the midst of the tent that David had pitched for it, and David offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before Adonai. Then when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of Adonai Tzvaot. Then he distributed to all the people, to the whole multitude of Israel, men and women alike, to every one a loaf of bread, a cake made in a pan, a raisin cake. Then all the people departed, each to his home. Here's further evidence that David was acting in the capacity of a priest. When the ark was housed among the Philistines, it brought death and destruction. But in the midst of Israel, it was blessing. And God's representative, here was King David, and he was assuring them of the blessings of God. But David was not a Levite, and certainly acting the part of a Levite here was against Mosaic law. And but we know that the Mosaic law had not been properly followed for centuries, basically before David. I mean, the 10 commandments, well, shoot, they weren't even 10 suggestions to these people. And so they had just done pretty much what they wanted. That's the whole book, the whole story of Judges. People did what was right in their own eyes. So finishing this off, David returned to bless his own household, but Saul's daughter Michal came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel distinguished himself today when he uncovered himself today in the eyes of the slave girls of his subject, as any vulgar fellow would shamelessly uncover himself. It was before Adonai, David said to Michal, who chose me instead of your father and all his household, appointing me ruler over the people of Adonai, over Israel. So I danced before Adonai, and I will dishonor myself even more than this, and I will be low in my own eyes, yet in the eyes of the slave girls whom you mentioned, I will be honored. So Saul's daughter Michal had no children to the day of her death. Okay, to me it's significant that David did not deny Michal's charge. In fact, he just kind of said, "Yeah, okay." All he said was, "Yeah, I was dancing before the Lord. He chose me, and so I'm dancing before Him." So, basically, I think what happens here is that she might not have ever had another chance to go out to him and say anything about this, because now she's just part of a harem, and she can't go to the king unless he calls for her. And plus, I think that he got her back just to spite, just for spite anyway. And so he wasn't going to call on her. She would never have another opportunity to speak to him. And so said that, she had no child to the day of her death. Okay, that was not, in my estimation, because God had struck her down with barrenness. No, I think what it amounted to is that from that point on, she was not ever back in the presence of David in a position so that she could conceive. Now, in First Samuel, in the First Samuel 21 and 10, it talks about her sons. She had 5 sons with Paltiel, I guess, and some of the manuscripts will say that they call it Merab, but it was another name or just a reference to Michal, the oldest daughter of Saul. And Josephus said that she had 5 children. So, excuse me. So anyway, Michal she never had any more children, and that's probably just a matter of not ever having an opportunity to, because she had 5 sons before. All right, so that pretty well closes out. I had a picture, a deal. I tried to, if you want some entertainment, pull up on YouTube and pull a David dancing before the ark or something like that. There's a movie out there on YouTube of David. I think it's Richard Gere playing the part. But if you can get past that, of David dancing, and it gives you a pretty good idea of what he may have been doing. I've tried to get it to show on here, and in fact I can show it, but it just doesn't have any sound to it, and so I don't know what will happen here. Let me go ahead and see if I can try that, and see if I can find another. Yeah, let's see if this will show it. But it's not going to, you're probably not going to have any sound on it. Now, it makes a liar out of me.
The sandaled feet. And you get to the place where you desire to take your Bible study to the next level. As you slowly learn how to go under the text,
you've got a different tab open, Dad.
You will soon discover that there is so much more to the beauty, grandeur of the Hebrew Bible that we had come to believe. Our easy-to-use program for studying biblical Hebrew
Something else is coming.
Some of the very best student-loving and encouraging teachers Israel has to offer. Second, I want
Okay, so I think you get the idea of
I think you get the idea of what that was all about, and so that's why she was not real happy with David for that. Okay, I see Cynthia had put the link there for you to pull up, but it kind of gives you an idea of what David was doing. So anyway, all right, that pretty well concludes what I had for tonight. Are there any comments or question on these two chapters?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you. You said that David fought the Philistines had three battles with them. Did he win all three of those battles?
Well, in this particular case, in these two chapters, there's two battles. Yes, but I mean he was successful against the Philistines just about every time he went out against them, because again, God was with him, and plus every time that he would go, he would inquire of God, okay, should I go? And then one time says, yeah. God says, go right directly against them, and another time he says, no, draw them in, sneak up behind them, and get them from the rear. And different tactics, different kinds of things. So yeah, I mean, in these two chapters, he had only confronted, he had two battles with them. But now in other chapters, I mean, David had been fighting the Philistines his whole life. Remember from Goliath forward,
Right.
that Israel had been confronting the Philistines David's entire life. And in fact, it was the Philistines then that killed Saul at Mount Gilboa.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Good. Any other comments or questions? All right. Well, then, I appreciate everybody showing up tonight and being with us. And we had, at least a new one there with Randy. Glad you're with us tonight. And
Rabbi,
yes.
I just had a quick question.
Okay.
What was the worship like for the people at that time, since they were having to retrieve the ark and things like that? What did their worship look like?
It was in fact, it was choreographed. There was the priests would do certain things. Now, we don't really know exactly what they would do, how they would do it, but the Bible speaks of different the times that they would that the Levites would sing, or they would play the instruments. And now at the time of David, this is actually before the Psalms were written, but I'm sure there were other songs that were available to the people before this. Later on in Israel's history, they had the Psalms and other songs, and they have the Hallel songs, so Psalms like 114 through 18, so forth, that they would sing at certain times. And then in the during the exile in Babylon, they talk about how can we sing the songs of Zion. when our hearts are so heavy. So we just hang our harps on the willows. And so there were, it wasn't per se something like we do today, where you've got musical instruments and you stand up there and play and sing and so forth. But they did have music, and they played instruments and or just clapped their hands or had cymbals or something like that. So we don't really know exactly how they did it, but we do know that it is prescribed in the Bible, where the priest would sing at certain points, or praise him with the stringed instruments and praise him with the harp, and that sort of thing. So there was something there. We just don't have it recorded, or no, nothing is actually written down. So a lot of it is just speculation as to how they did that. So I really can't give you a real good answer on that, to and I'm not even going to joke that, okay, I'll just make something up. No, it's we don't have a good record of how they actually performed worship, how the common people would perform worship. It was a different thing. Now we do know that in the sages tell us, and it is recorded like in the Talmud and so forth, that when say for instance on the certain festivals and feasts, they would play a lot of music and they would just praise the Lord. Now, what does that sound like? What does that look like? Well, I would think that it would be some kind of a song that people know. People love songs, and they would maybe sing the song of Moses, which I will sing unto the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously, the horse and rider thrown into the sea. Not particularly exactly like that, but you get what I'm talking about. But or the Song of Miriam, or they talk about these different songs that the people would have known, and so there would have been some kind of thing. Now we do know that say for instance during Yom Kippur, and they would have the Day of Atonement. And during that time, they said that when this is not biblical and not in the Bible, but extra biblical, the Talmud and so forth, that the high priest would come out and he would say the name of Adonai, that the Tetragrammaton, that he would come out there and say that, and the power of God was so strong that the people couldn't stand. Everyone within the sound of the priest's voice, they couldn't stand, because the power of God would just come over them. We know that when the temple, Solomon's temple, was dedicated, that there again, the power of God was so strong there that none of the priests could get up off the ground and perform their duties, because they were just, the weight of the heaviness, the kavod was so heavy on them that they couldn't get up. God's glory, God's power, his presence was so strong that they couldn't get up. And so that was when nowadays you hear about people talking about in Pentecostal circles about being slain in the spirit. Well, that's a real good example right there, when Solomon's temple was dedicated, where the heaviness, the kavod, was so hard on the people that they couldn't even stand up in God's presence. So that must have been something to experience that. But no, we don't have any songs that are recorded from that, other than the words of like the Song of Miriam, the Song of the Sea, that sort of thing. So that
Thank you.
that wasn't a real good answer, but it's all I got. So, all right. Any other comments or questions? All right, then I'm going to say Shavua Tov, have a good week, and I'm going to stop the recording.